question that a union asked during a communicated governance meeting, and the board member responded with their proposed solution without other board members' knowledge of that being proposed. So I guess I would ask, in that instance, would there be, or I'd like a difference of opinion on that. Ms., can you use your mic, please?
Sorry. Test, okay. So, specific to the example that you gave, it seems to me that if we are going to have to eventually vote on a contract, that we should not be giving language to the entity or the union relative to what might work. I just don't think that's appropriate, because it has to come to us eventually for approval or not. And it, as an individual, I feel if I did that I would be setting some expectation to the entity or the outside or the organization that the board supports that, when I'm only acting when my intent is to act as an individual. So that's relative to that last example. And we did discuss it a little bit the last time. But I think that, I mean, we are a board, a collection of 7 people, and we need to, for me, for my comfort level and what I think is appropriate is for us to consider those things together. So if there was a request for language or help or whatever, and the administration could not do it, if it's not appropriate for them, then I don't really know that it's going to be appropriate for us.
Ms. Hilding?
But like, I bounce ideas around with different groups and say, what do you guys think about, just as part of like learning and trying to figure out what could we possibly do. And I guess I don't know what the difference is. Like, what is...
So the difference in asking me my opinion and the difference in you writing your opinion about something and it represents the board, that's the difference for me.
Mr. Donnelly?
Well, first of all, this discussion has drifted from the actual factual basis of the issue, of the question involved once again. It was something that was presented to somebody as a draft, very clearly expressing that it was only one person's suggestion as a possible draft solution. If we have to run every draft of every idea we ever come up with by everybody on this board, how are we ever going to get anything done? It's perfectly appropriate to come up with a draft idea, take it to somebody and say, what do you think of this draft? And there was absolutely no representation that was on behalf of the board. So let's just stop talking about that, because people start talking about things like that and then it becomes part of the factual basis of the incident, and it wasn't.
And I absolutely appreciate the clarification, but I thought I said if I did that, it would be uncomfortable for me.
Mr. Holloman?
I do want to point out, I still feel that if you're discussing board policy that different groups or organizations might wish to see happen, that's something we can develop with them offline before it comes to the board. If it does revolve around a contract or bargaining, it becomes an entirely different matter. That was the point of my wishing to clarify when we're in bargaining with groups and when we're not. When we're not bargaining with groups, you can have interesting, detailed conversations about different things. If we're in bargaining and a board member does that, you stepped across a legal line. And that's one reason I think we need clarity in it. But I still feel that as long as people understand they're just talking to a board member and not someone who's representing the board about issues in our policy that they see as problematic or could be improved, that's just us interacting with our various communities and different groups. It shouldn't be hidden, it shouldn't be secret, and certainly if it was, we wouldn't be talking about it at all. You know, it comes to the board at some point as a more finished document that really represents that group. think the key thing is that people just continually have to reassure folks they're not representing the board. They're just representing a person who's on the board and gets to have the microphone from time to time.
Ms. Hilding?
But I do think it's better practice if we are even drafting a policy amendment that it starts with a committee. And like I've done this before, we say, what do you guys think? And I write all your notes down and then I come up with a draft based on board or committee input. And then you make sure all the stakeholders, so it doesn't look like there's any favoritism or, you know, everybody has a chance to equally have input. So, I mean, I think that's a more open process, and it does take things longer to get done, but in the end we can avoid some bumps.
I think my concern with this particular example was the perception that was perceived from the other entity, and the fact that instead of sending their response to Mr. Donnelly, they sent it to me as the school board president, and I knew nothing about it. So that's my concern, is that maybe the perception was there, and we just have to be aware of, even though we state we're not representing the board, that there is a perception sometimes there when you respond as a board member that you're acting as a board. But I do agree with you, Ms. Hildy, that I think we are a board of 7, and anytime we do have conversations. I think the difference is when you put it in writing and submit it. Mr. Donnelly?
Nobody submitted anything. It was a draft. It was a problem that was brought to the board months and months prior to this. And in looking at the state law and the contract, it looks like it was a very legitimate concern, and it looks like it was a violation of state law, for one thing. And yet nothing was happening to correct it. So after months of inaction, I took a stab at trying to fix a draft that might fix the problem, and sent it to the folks who had pointed out that we were in violation of state law, and said, how about this? Would this, in your opinion, would this fix it? And I clearly said it was as an individual member of the board. So it wasn't submitting it as some sort of proposal, as final proposal. It was a draft aimed at doing something that wasn't getting done by anybody else on a legitimate concern.
And you're right, Mr. Donnelly, it was a draft, and it did say it was coming from you, and I understand that. My concern is when the entity responded to me, thinking that this was a board, again, it's perception. It's perception and what people perceive. So I do understand what you were trying to do. I'm not faulting that. I'm just trying to say that as a board, we need to realize that perception, and that we do act as 7, and there are protocol and procedures that we have to follow. And I only bring this up because it's just my opinion. I want to get the consensus of the rest of the board. Sure.
I just wanted to add in just the fact that I go through similar issues, that when I have a conversation, the hat I wear of superintendent never leaves me. And so they believe that, oh, if I just have a side conversation at a barbecue, it's the superintendent that said that. In any one of your jobs, it's the same thing. I think working for the university, if you say something, well, Margot, she's obviously no. I think, Member Donnelly, and all due respect, you've been challenged and actually kind of pushed back a little bit on people who challenge your affiliation because you work for the government. So you can't take being a part of the administration hat off and on, even though you try to explain, now, wait a minute, that's different work, that's this. You're continuing having to do that. And it's not because it's something that we do purposefully, it's that it's very difficult for the general public to differentiate our hats. And so, I mean, we're just public people, and it makes it difficult, and it doesn't seem like it's fair because you want to be a regular person. I think our principals, this has them, teachers as well. It's difficult to be in the public when you're seen in a certain way. And so I just want to add that there isn't fault, it's just literally the way it is, and a little bit of our individualism goes away because of the job or the position for which we carry. Just to, if that helps explain anything, that.
Thank you. Any other comments? Nope. So I think coming out of this, what we're trying to do is say, you know, do we need to change this? Do we need to be more specific? Do we understand about perception? I mean, this is kind of an action item. Do we not need to take any further action? I'm asking the board. Ms. Vacalis.
The way that it's currently written, you know, no individual action that could compromise the board, I think that's fine just the way it is. I think that we need to not try and rewrite this one thing for one instance.
Okay.
I think we've had a good conversation on how we speak as seven, on the power of perception, all those kinds of things. I can come up with a half a dozen really bad examples or good examples out of bad things that can compromise. It's not just this one thing.
Right.
And so I would hate to try and rewrite this into something to fit one scenario when this isn't the right place to do something like that.
Okay, thank you. So are we ready to move forward?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So the next one is board members will maintain the confidentiality of any and all information provided them in executive session of the board until such information is disclosed as required by law, recognizing that each board member has been placed in a position of trust by the community and constitutes who reside within the boundaries of ASD.
Did you have who was that? It's number 7. So if you can just tell people where to find it, that's number
Oh, number 7, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was just, it was a discussion point that was brought up by Andy.
Okay, so Andy brought that one up last time. I'm sorry, Ms. Hildy.
Oh, I just remember that the issue was if you had heard about the thing before exec session, and I think the standard is if it's talked about in exec session, don't talk about it, because if the person knows that it was talked about in exec session, for all they know, you're just compromising that confidentiality. They don't know that you heard about it before. But if we're really going to say, no, we don't talk about those things, I don't comment on that, even if you knew about it before, I don't think the breach of trust is worth the ease of conversation or.
Mr. Holman?
It's also the question of, let's say you also read about it later in the newspaper. There's a point where if something is commonly known, but we say, well, this came up in executive session, so I can't talk about it. Somehow we suddenly become artificially the least informed person in the room. So there should be a way that at some point we can talk about things that came up in executive session if they truly are known to the public through some other method. And that's the extent of my question. And I realize it's somewhat technical. It's not a desire to find a way to take information that comes up in executive session and go somewhere with it. But at some point, things get talked about in executive session that aren't executive. They're just there anyway.
Ms. Vacalis?
Generally what happens in executive session, even if it is a topic that's already out there, and you know we've had plenty of those instances, it's ASD's position on those topics, and that's not what is supposed to be outside of executive session, is my understanding. Yes, there's a lot of things we read about in the paper or on the news that we have discussions about, but it's the aspect we're not allowed to talk about, which is where we stand, or you know, litigation aspects of it, or any of those kinds of things. And so while we might be able to talk about the elements that that are publicly known in the paper or something like that, there's absolutely nothing out of executive session that should ever come out, you know, before it's legally allowed to.
Ms. Hildy?
And I understand like stuff coming out in the newspaper afterward and everybody's talking, and you're standing there and you're like, you know, and they know you know something about it. And I think we just lean into that awkwardness, because preserving the trust of, we don't talk about personnel issues, we don't talk about litigation issues, we don't talk about student discipline issues that have been part of that process. I think that's worth preserving more than a couple awkward conversations.
Mr. Holman?
to respond, as you mentioned, there's a point where legally you can talk about it, and that's the line I'm trying to find. Like I say, I'm not on a quest to find ways to reveal information, but rather there are times, like I say, not everything that gets mentioned in executive session is actually executive information. Some of it is public, and the fact that we hear it inside that room in a special context shouldn't prevent us from being able to talk to people about it when it matters. And clarity on that would just be helpful for me.
Can you give an example?
Not that it's ever actually happened, but just as something I can think of, we might discuss salary issues to an upcoming contract. At some point, that information becomes public and we vote on it, and it's in the public record, and it becomes a reality. So there's some point where we can acknowledge, say, an increase in salary or decision to vote yes on that. And I would still maintain that what individuals said in executive session about it remains confidential. But the fact that we know those increases have taken place, it's become public. There's a line where it crosses over. It becomes okay for us to talk about that. And I've never been in a technical discussion about exactly where that line gets crossed at certain times with information.
Ms. Mitchell?
I think that some of those issues are going to be addressed at the AASB Fall Boardsmanship Conference. I think they have a whole day on legal issues, so that might be a place to get more clarity if you have the opportunity to attend that. I think that's on the Saturday, maybe?
Sunday.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Ms. Hildy?
And certainly if there's a question, we could just talk about it. I mean, if there, like, a real fact pattern comes up, I mean,
Yeah.
just say, what do you guys think, you know?
Yep. Okay. And we'll make sure are you going to board? Okay, we can certainly ask that question at that time too, Andy, if you're not going to be there. On the next page, number 11, board members, and this was you, Dina. Board members will work to build a common vision and consensus among all community groups and organizations. Okay. It's number 11.
You know, I'm thinking that maybe my question was, is that something that we should be proactively doing? Is there, and I think part of the strategic planning process will bring more to our mind different groups that we could be reaching out to. But is that something that maybe we want to have a list of, you know, sort of that asset mapping thing of here are groups that, in general, it would be nice to have board members think about reaching out to. So if there are opportunities, I think that might be where my head was at with that.
And we had talked about this before, about not only community councils, but community groups that as board members, if we wanted to reach out to them and maybe attend their meetings occasionally or something. I know it was brought up. I don't think we had really discussed it, but that might be something we can bring up. Yes, Ms. Hildy.
And I just, maybe even just the opposite of that, and instead of us just going and sitting through meetings, but being more purposeful and inviting them to governance meetings or communications meetings and saying, if somebody from your organization wants to come sit in and just hear what we're doing, and I think that might be able to bring more people in, just from a time perspective, and I don't know.
Okay, great. Ms. Mitchell?
I really like that idea, and maybe we even want to think about, you know, at some point doing community updates where we invite people in a couple times a year to do updates on things that are relevant. But I think that just having a you know, as we think of groups, maybe we have a place on board docs, or maybe there is already, where we add groups that we think, oh, you know, this is a group that it might be good, just so that, I mean, I think for all of us, it might be good to,
That you might have a connection with and can reach out to.
yeah.
Okay.
Or just,
And if there's a group that you'd like to, of course, you can always do that. Ms. Mello?
And one of the things I thought of from the communications committee perspective is, making sure we have the resources and the tools we need when we go out and talk. And then maybe reporting at that time at the communications committee, just kind of tracking who we're talking to and what the questions are. I think it will just help all of us be able to be more responsive.
Ms. Hildy?
And along that vein, it might be helpful if we are at a community council just to email you and say, here's some questions that are coming up as communications chair. Here's some questions I've been hearing lately, and then you have some direction on what should be in the,
Right. Yeah, okay, great. All right, the next one is under board member request administration on non-agenda items, number 3 and 4, and I think we've already really tackled this. We talked about, we are reinstating the request for information. Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because you've got it.
I have a draft meeting already created, and so then as questions come in, we can log them in, and as a group, either at a work session or during new business, you can look and see what the questions are and prioritize to see if it's something that everyone agrees they want to be researched, and if it's a high priority, low priority. That's how it used to be done anyway.
Right. And then what we're doing too is any questions are going to Dr. Bishop and myself, and Dr. Bishop is determining whether it needs to go on there or if it's something that she can address very quickly. That doesn't mean the same thing when we're asking questions about our agenda for our upcoming meetings. If you have a question about something like that, to clarify information that we're receiving for our board meetings, of course, that would not go, unless it's a little more entailed, but hopefully those questions would be able to be answered before the board meeting, so you'd have that information. Okay, any questions on that? This was Elisa, and this is under communications between the board and superintendent, and it's 1C. Board agendas and support materials as requested are required, including upcoming draft agendas and the current, we already talked about this, so, okay. So on the next page, and Andy, this was you, and I think we've already talked about it too, communication between the board and ASD staff. Maybe not. Avoid discussing confidential information and limit disclosing information that is not publicly available to individuals with a need to know. Such information, recognizing that the identity of the individuals may be disclosed when necessary. Okay. Was that you, Margot?
My note said to clean up the language.
Yeah,
Okay.
that doesn't make sense, that sentence.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So, and that's why I thought we were sending it back to government.
That one we will send back to governance. Okay.
We could possibly just correct the syntax quickly right now.
Right here? Well, let's do it
I
then.
mean, we got an English major.
Okay, let's do it. Are you ready? Okay.
All right. Board members will avoid disclosing confidential information and limit disclosing information that is not publicly available to public, period. Or take out to individuals with a need to know such information, and then just continue recognizing that they identify. No, I just think period. Yeah, that's not
And
publicly
then-
available. Yeah. Keep it simple. Sweetheart.
So your recommendation is avoid disclosing confidential information and limit disclosing information that's not public, period? Publicly available. And then that's it. And then the rest of it, we would just eliminate, or do we need that?
Well, why do you have to limit disclosing information that is not publicly available? I understand avoid disclosing confidential information. Oh, is do conversations that are off the record? Press maybe that are off the record. So like if, like Dr. Bishop says, here's a kind of cool idea that I'm thinking about, we don't go out saying, oh, we're doing this whole new thing. You know, maybe that's the limit information that is not publicly available, because you're just kind of tossing around ideas or something like that, off the record.
Or it, yes, Mr. Holloman.
I'm going to say there are times that we see charts or we see information that's not necessarily posted anywhere, i.e. it's not publicly available, but it's not confidential. I think there needs to be a distinction between confidential and publicly available. I mean, to me, publicly available means that people can go find it somewhere, not necessarily that it's meant to be kept from people. It's just simply not available. I may ask the superintendent for enrollment information that's of interest to me that you can't get through the dashboard. And if they supply that to me, it's not confidential and it's not secret. It's just not something that's generally known or easily obtainable. So I don't think we mean to restrict that. I have to admit, I have, I guess, a little bit of, it's a little strange to me that we have a regulation that says you will not disclose confidential information, because if you have to say it, it all, I don't know. Of course you don't. That's why it's called confidential.
I mean, in our laws and everything, most rules are written due to something
Right.
happening. And whether, I mean, not just policy, but laws in general. We have speeding,
Yeah.
you know,
but we don't have a rule
zones
that
because-
says don't break that rule.
Yeah.
We just have a rule, and the rule is you have confidential information. That's information you're not supposed to share. That's already a rule. So we can have another rule that says don't do that, but I'm okay with that. The emphasis is okay. But I do want to say I think we can make a distinction about not publicly available. That's simply information that's not obtainable easily, and is separate and apart from confidential information.
So it should say, Andy's right, do not disclose confidential information. Will not, so board members will not disclose confidential information. Instead of avoid disclosing, will not disclose. And then are you okay with it saying limit disclosing information that is not publicly available? I did not understand the conclusion of your.
I don't see the harm in disclosing things that aren't publicly available as long as it's not confidential.
So you wanted to say will not disclose confidential information.
But I think we have to, I think we have to remember that sometimes you could disclose something that's public information, but it could lead to them figuring out who that individual is, or, so I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. Ms. Michaelis?
The other thing, we need to remember what section this is under, between us and board and ASD staff.
right.
This is not the community section.
Right.
And so this might be where somebody at a school tells us something that, you know, they have really big concerns about, or, you know, another program or something like that. And we need to talk about it with the superintendent, or, you know, pass on the information appropriately, whatever it is. We just need to remember the section that this is under and what the context of this is, where, yes, we won't disclose confidential information because that's a big no-no, but the limit of disclosing information not publicly available, to Andy's point, we do have some of these conversations, and sometimes we might know something that, while it may not be out there, it can be a conversation that we might have with a staff or, you know, administration member or something like that, that they have access to, but we don't know if they do or not, but it's not publicly.
Right.
And so we just need to remember the context where this section is, and not get it too big, because that's the whole next section.
Actually, that's a very good point. A lot of these safety issues that we're dealing with, we do want the board, we let the board know, and then part of the process is the board, the rest of administration, working directly with the school, then it goes to staff, then it goes to parents. And so if we were to, I mean, folks would be very upset if there's actually a protocol for safety that releases that information. So that's a good example of, you might find out something 10 minutes before and then put it on a, you know, Facebook or something that would actually interfere with the police. You know, so we do have a very distinct no, and usually by the end it is well known, but there's a path so that schools can work through the safety issues at the schools. And as you know, many of the board members get those that say, hey, we want to let you know this went on, we don't have any more information as we work through it. That's a good point. I didn't think that that's a good example of that.
So given that, yes, Mr. Donnelly?
I think this has been a good discussion. It points out the incredible difficulty of limiting speech. I mean, the limit disclosing information is not publicly available to individuals with a need to know such information. It's very problematic. I mean, I certainly recognize there's times where we're privy to information that good judgment would say we should run right out and talk about because it deals with public safety or there's some immediate concern. But in Alaska, we have some pretty strong open records and free speech laws. And so anytime we have these kinds of limitations, they need to be very artfully crafted, and I don't think this one is.
So do you want to refer to governance and spend more time on it?
I think it's going to be hard to craft something this complex when it's a freedom of speech issue and immediately come up with a solution.
Okay, then the recommendation is that we'll go back to governance. Mr. Hallman, if you'll make a note of that, please. Thank you. Okay. Next one is under communication between the board and community. Sorry, next page. Next page is under email protocol.
Can I ask a quick question
Sure.
about the last
Sure.
section? So number 3, board members may request information from ASD staff that is readily available. If the information is not readily available, the staff may refer the request to the superintendent. So we had a situation a couple weeks ago where I thought the information was readily available, and then I learned that it wasn't that readily available. So I'm wondering if it should just be all requests go to the superintendent and the president. I'm not sure how to approach that, or
Yeah, all requests should go through the superintendent president. The superintendent will make the determination of what time commitment. If it's going to be a further time commitment, then she'll recommend that it goes on the RFI, and we as a board look at that.
should we not copy anybody else? I mean, I think in that situation, I sent it to the CFO because I thought it was a quick question. And so should I not copy them? Should I leave that up to the two of you to figure out who it gets funneled to?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
We had.
So we might want to change the way this is worded, because this says board members may request information from ASD staff that is readily available. Maybe it should just say board members should issue all requests to.
So the only difference would be, well, board docs. I mean, if we're having a board meeting and we need clarification on something, do you still want that to go through you? Okay.
Madam President, yes, we had discussed that, I mean, that doesn't necessarily, once it's made public and that it's something that the board is non-action or action, it's gone through our steps here so that if there's a question from a board member about, whoa, this is non-action, I don't really understand this, you see who the memo's from, you can call that person and say, hey, if it's in, most of it, a lot of it is in capital, call Tom and say, Tom, I don't, can I get some more information about this? I don't really understand it. Or whether it's maybe teaching and learning on a textbook or something. But once it's publicly and you're having to vote and it's in public anyway, I would hope that you would, and staff know, to just answer board questions so that they can, if we went through our process and there's still not enough information, be sure to have them ready to be able to vote and discuss it. It's those things that are kind of out of the blue that come in that are difficult to work through. So those out of the blue things, actually, Andy does a great job. I mean, he has lots of questions, but he sends them to Star and me, and I was like, yep, this one's easy greasy. Well, how about we answer it this way? Or, you know what, I'm gonna have to ask staff whether this is hard or not, because I don't even know how they gather that information. So it just helps if it goes, and, we'll try to get you the information, because I know you have constituents that might be asking you. So it just helps with the process, because if you do go to staff, they're going to come to me, and it's going to slow down that process. So
So I'm thinking that maybe this is one, maybe we need to be more specific that if it's information that's a non-action or action item, that they can call the individual on the memo to ask those questions, and it doesn't necessarily need to go through Dr. Bishop or I, is what I'm hearing. Ms. Vacalis?
But you guys, it seems like you guys are talking specific to, you know, things happening immediately in meetings, whether it's a non-action or an action item. What if I have a question specifically about our last 10 years of, you know, bond debt, or, you know, just a simple question, it's readily available, finance is easily going to have it, you know, something like that. I don't view this particular thing as limiting it to memos, but all the other information that are just quick snippets.
even if they're quick snippets, the board, once a board member gets information, the whole board should have it. So what that allows is when you go through STAR, or the president,
Yeah.
and the superintendent, it is assured that the answer will go to all board members, so that not one board member has information that other board members, because that's part of your policy as well. So to enable us to meet that part of your policy, when you request that, that's why everything goes in, and it just says a board member requested, and then you're wondering, you know, where did this come from? It's because somebody had asked, and we wanted, it was quick and easy, but we wanted all board members to have the same information. So it isn't some board members have some and some have the other. That's really the purpose, Elisa, of that.
Okay, so I guess
If it
it goes
helps.
counter when we go back to page 2, where it says board member requests to administration on non-agenda items. So one of these random community questions, where number 1 says a board member would direct requests for information that are not readily available by ASD staff. If it's, you know, a quick 5-minute thing, it says that that can be done by there. If they write back and say, you know what, that's going to take some time, so then therefore it goes back to this page and says, then I do that. And so that's where I'm getting that from, not every single question that we get, but just the ones where they're not readily available, if I'm.
That's a good point. Maybe it's just not clarified, but there is a part of the board policy or somewhere where it says if one board member gets the information, all can. And the way that we ensure that that happens is that the questions are funneled back, and then that's why they go to all your communication. And if we don't know, the only other way, so what I've asked staff is, if someone comes to you for information, let me know, because then we'll publish it in the Board Connect. And that's why over time, you've seen a board member asked, That's how that's happened, so that I'm and our staff is following your policy.
Yeah, so number 2 says that information requested by one board member that is relevant to the entire board, well, and that's a little, you know, subjective. And so maybe just that whole flow just needs to be a little bit cleaned up then, because I always thought that a quick, you know, 2 to 5 minute answer could easily get responded to, but it, you know, may only pertain to something that somebody's asking me. If you want to go to everybody, otherwise you too might get pummeled with an awful lot of requests, whether they are 5 minutes or 5 hours, and you guys will have to determine whether they are quick answers or they're going to take some time and research and have to come back to the board for a vote or something like that. But I don't read it quite that way, but that would be worth cleaning up.
And Madam President, even if you do just ask one person, it comes back to me anyway, because that's our operations, so that to ensure that your policy's met. So even if your intent wasn't to like make a lot of work, if you go to administration, they're like, hey, they were asked, I'm going to give them this, do you want it in the Board Connect? And I look at it and it's like, oh yeah, that's something all board members should have. Some of it is like silly little stuff. I mean, just like, hey, what color is that paint? I mean, that's not a big deal, but when it has something to do with something that as a board unit, you should all have the same information, we publish it. So on our end, it's the same. Yeah.
Mr. Donnelly?
Thank you, Madam President. On the communication between the board and ASD staff, 1B, I'm concerned with the language after the comma and particularly, but do not make promises about actions to be taken. We already have clear prohibitions on any individual member making any commitments on behalf of the board. And I think that's very inartful language. First of all, what is a promise? A promise may be interpreted as a commitment, but is that the same as a promise? And about actions to be taken, what actions? Are they actions of the board as a group or actions of the individual? Because if the individual wants to say, I'm going to bring this up and discuss this at the next work session, that's an action that will be taken, and that's a commitment to bring it up. I don't think that's inappropriate. So I think what the juxt of this, although it very inartfully is worded, is to prevent board members from making commitments on behalf of the entire board as an individual. But it's just very poorly written and can be interpreted a lot of different ways. I don't think it's really necessary because we already have clear prohibitions on that are clear.
Any other thoughts or comments on that? Andy, maybe this is another one that we could just reword this and make it appropriate. Thank you. Okay, if there's nothing else on that page, we're going to move over to page 4. Oh, sure, Mr. Donnelly.
I had brought up a concern about, under communications between the board and community, section 4, and in particular, the section in parentheses that board members are supposed to produce a summary of any phone conversation with a member of the public. I don't think that's anywhere close to what the Open Meetings and Records Act requires. I think it's kind of crazy, actually, that every conversation you ever had with a member of the public, you're supposed to write it out, a synopsis of it, and provide it to anybody. I think there's a lot of private conversations that occur that would be a serious infringement on free speech, both on us as individuals and as board members, of just any phone conversation you ever had. I just don't think it's appropriate to have there.
Other comments? Ms. Sildy?
I agree. The email one is covered under email, and that if somebody is contacting the school board and I got a thing to say back, I need to copy you and Dr. Bishop on. But we talked, I mean, one, we're just not doing it. And I simply couldn't. I wouldn't have time to do all that.
Do all board members feel like that we want to take that out? Okay. Okay, per the recommendation of the board, we are going to strike out or a summation of phone conversations. Good?
Well, we have to vote on all this?
Well,
Like,
right, but
well,
I mean,
like
this
present
is,
it-
yeah,
yeah. So.
That's the recommendation. Yep. Thank you, Ms. Hildy. I wasn't trying to circumvent. Yes, ma'am. Turn your,
I talk loud. On that same page, number 3, are we just referring to the email protocol for that? Under number 3, under communications between board and community.
well, I think you still have to keep number 4 because it says there could be,
No, number
Oh.
3. So are we, I guess my question is, I made a note here for 3 and 4 that we were going to review both of those relative to the email protocol. And I don't know that we want to do that now, but in other words, it was all covered in the email protocol. But it was redundant, is all I'm
Oh,
saying. So when
okay.
it
I
goes
see what
back
you're
to
saying.
governance, if we could
Clean it up.
Clean it up. yeah.
okay.
Sorry, wasn't clear.
Nope, that's great. Thank you. Okay, page number 4, email protocol. Responses to emails which board members choose to answer will be copied to board president, superintendent, and board secretary. I haven't seen a problem with that. I think, individuals that have responded, I've been copied on. Yes, Ms. Hilda.
I mean, I think I haven't done this. Like, if it comes to the board or if it's like all 7 of our names listed, then lots of times I have just replied and not copied anybody else on it. So that was wrong, but there should be more. Now I just let you do it, but just making sure that's really clear, because I also feel nervous, like, putting a bunch of emails out to everybody and don't want to flood everybody else's inboxes.
Well, and I know some board members like to answer, you know, because it goes to all board members, they like to respond or say something. Mr. Donnelly?
This is another one where there's a gray area. I think a lot of times I'll just say, thank you for your thoughts, so keep them in mind. I mean, I'm not taking any position, I'm not advocating any position. I want them to just know that
You
I
saw
got
it.
their message.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem like everybody needs to get cross-copied
Right.
1,000 times with little, thank you for your thoughts messages. We're just assuring that person we actually read their comment and we acknowledge that they made a comment, you know? If it's a more substantive thing, I do think it's appropriate.
I agree. Are we in agreement with that, Ms. Michaelis?
I'm in agreement, but chose should be choose.
Yeah, okay, we'll make that change.
Thank you.
Do you see that on number B? Yeah? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, moving to page 5. I have a star by number 3 on the very top. Board members retain the right to respond to emails as an individual, but must understand that each communication may be interpreted, and I think we've already gone over this, unless somebody wants to discuss it further. Number 4, Ms. Mitchell, I have your name by this, but it says board members may choose to share individual emails and the responses with other board members if the email is not of a personal or confidential nature, sharing of the email or related communication does not violate the Alaska OMA.
So again, I think that this was an issue of redundancy, because we
Okay.
already did talk about the fact that board members are going to copy the president and the secretary and the board secretary, so this was redundant.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Ms. Hildy?
I don't think this one's redundant. It's about individual emails. So if somebody emails me and they say, I want you to, I mean, just because they know me, I get a
Right,
lot like that.
right.
And then I send a response. So I think the whole board should know what I wrote. I can do that as long as it doesn't violate the Open Meetings Act. So there's 2 kinds of emails. Big group board ones, which I think if they list each of our 7 names should count as a board email. And then ones that sometimes I get in horrible email chains and I don't know how, and because somebody knew me and they said, I'll just tack her name on, you know, maybe you guys want to know too.
Ms. Mitchell?
Well, so then there is the issue of the ones that come to the whole school board when we reply. It sounds like you're saying we should do reply all, but the policy says we should reply and copy the president, the secretary, and there were 3 people, I thought, but maybe that was it, the president and the secretary. Is the superintendent?
For
on there
emails
too?
to the whole board, you
Yeah.
do Katie, Dr. Bishop, and
Yeah, so 3
Star.
people. So do we want to do reply also? Everybody sees them? Do we want to just do that? Do we want to have the policy be the same for an individual email as for the group email?
Mr. Donnelly?
I'm just thinking back on our training on the open meetings law, and as soon as you hit that reply all, then you got a new question involved, where if you limit it to the president and the superintendent, you don't have that problem.
I think you can do a reply all as long as people don't respond to it. But that's the danger, right? That we start getting. So that, yeah.
So you can always go out to Google Docs and it'll show on there that it's been responded to either by administration or myself or whoever. So you'll see that I try to be Johnny on the spot. Sometimes I copy Katie, so hopefully she does it. But there is a log out there that says what emails have been responded to. I think it is important to go through the president and the superintendent, because a lot of times when those emails come in to the whole board, it is supposed to be myself responding to that, unless I ask another board member to do that, or I ask Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Bishop, kind of combine those, to maybe have someone else answer that.
So I guess my only question is you're right, we do get individual emails from people who know us personally, but if they're sent to our school board email address, then it's still kind of official. So should we follow the same protocol in responding to those?
My, I would say yes, and the understanding is that many emails that come through have listed either children's names, other children in school, staff names, because someone might be upset, and we have confidentiality of information laws that we must follow. And so it's just, I mean, just as a practice, I think to Dave's thing, you're going to have another question if you kind of go back. Employee rights, students' rights, things like that. When the person is sending it to us, you know, they're, you know, whatever thought process they're going to, they need you to know. And then what we do with it matters the most. And I think to play safe, kind of what Dave referenced is, you know, if you reply, hit it here and here, because we just don't want to get in the mix that those become public emails. Especially with our reply and in protecting student rights and employee rights. There's always the backside of a story that we don't know when parents share, and we just want to be sure that we go through due process.
So then we just need to change the procedure for that section, right? For the individual emails.
Okay, any other conversation? Okay, then we're going to move down to meeting procedures, preparation of agenda. This one has been, and this is number 2 and number 3. Any board member may make a request to the board president a subject be included on an agenda for a meeting. If 2 or more board members concur, that request will be forwarded in writing to the board president and copied to the board secretary and superintendent no less than 9 business days prior to the regular board meeting. The board president will ensure that any topics the board or individual board members request to be addressed will be considered. So the question is, I think you almost have to bring this up in new business unless you've spoken to another board member, and I have a request that 2 board members are asking, because you have to have somebody second that to be able to get it.
In writing.
In writing, yes. The other thing we've been very conscious of is the 9 business days. So we are following that very closely. That has to be received within that 9 business days. There have been examples of when we haven't received that. It's been brought up to amend the agenda. And again, that would be voted on, whether we would amend that or not, but that's another procedure. Ms. Hildy.
And I just like us to try to stay away from that if it's not absolutely necessary, because we want the public to be able to participate and have notice, and all of us not be caught off guard, you know.
Clarifies that in number 3.
And then,
New agenda amendment.
okay, and then on page 6, board member preparation for meetings, and this is number 3. It was brought up by Alicia and Dave. Board members will submit requests for additional information or questions about regular board meeting agenda items to the superintendent or designate no less than 4 business days prior to the regular board meeting.
What is that? Thursday?
Okay.
Is that the Thursday before board
It
meeting?
says 4 business days prior to the regular board meeting.
So, Thursday.
I think the discussion was that it was a goal, you know, something to strive for, but that if some conversation comes up, it might be shorter than the 4 days. Oh, sorry.
Say that again.
Oh, I was just saying that the conversation around that, if I recall, was that the 4 days was a goal that, you know, to strive for, but that, you know, sometimes in conversation, you know, a question might come up and that deadline's not possible, or those days. It was just a specific time frame within the policy.
Okay, any questions, comments on that one? Mr. Donnelly?
I don't think I highlighted this one, but I can see once again where this is, it's reasonable, but at the same time, there could be some event that occurred within those 4 days that might have raised questions not available prior to that, and I think we should just be reasonable about it. I mean, if it's obvious, oh my goodness, the mayor called us and said, we got a problem with this, I think it's reasonable to ask a question about that, you know.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think this is just a guideline, and but things do come up. Ms. Hildy?
Yeah, I agree with Member Donnelly, but that we also aren't doing this part of it, the 4 days thing. So as we kind of transition and do a better job of being prepared, preparing more than the weekend before and taking time to review the agenda a week before and
You
thinking.
mean like Monday night and submitting the
thinking
question
through,
Tuesday
yeah.
morning?
Which I would prefer to not, you know,
Yeah,
I think
I know.
everybody would still prefer that, but just our practice of creating new habits.
We know things happen. Okay. Well, believe it or not, we've just gone through all that and had a discussion, and we referred, what, 2 things, Mr. Holloman, to governance? Yeah, very good. Thank you, board. We did have one other thing on there, and that was professional development training suggestions. Again, I've only received those from Margot. I think, Ms. Mitchell, did you have some suggestions?
Well, I did want to try to have specific suggestions, but I don't. But
Okay.
in general, what I would like is, and this was great, the opportunity to have this discussion and to have the time to have this discussion. I would love to have, you know, the whole idea of this lunch and learn was more to, for us to get deeper knowledge about things, and also to have more time for us to informally talk with each other and kind of, you know, understand each other's motivations and where we're at, because I think that, you know, everybody here knows that the 7 habits of highly effective boards, that one of the things that is critical is, you know, being kind of, you know, shared goals and agreeing on process and having a shared understanding. So for me, I would love to have, and I know some of this is work session stuff, but more, it's a balancing act between having a topic on the work session, but just, or having it more informal. Like, you know, what do you guys talk about in terms of what's the thinking in the administration on the things that are most effective to move learning? Or what do you guys talk about that you think can really boost attendance? Or, you know, things that, or, you know, what's the latest, you know, maybe have a topic around what somebody was really excited about at a conference they went to. I think things that give me, the session we had when Senator Begich was here with that group, it was really nice to hear a little more depth from different departments, what's going on in the district, and it deepens my knowledge. So those kinds of opportunities I really would welcome. And process things are good too, and the training that the AASB does, but just things that really, because I don't come from, you know, a K through 12 pedagogical background. So the more I learn, the more I can understand limitations, and you know, college students are not the same as kindergartners. So,
Ms. Hildy?
I agree with Dean, even though that's maybe not professional development. When we have opportunities to be walking along in our understanding, and then when it comes to decision time, we're all equipped to make those decisions. Like, I know Dr. Bishop's talked about 21st century learning before, and there's like about this much in my head that kind of, oh, what's that thing again? You know, and you know, I want to be prepared to make the decisions that our students need us to be able to make. And it's hard to do that if we kind of wait to the last minute and playing catch up. But from a professional development, I'm not sure that we really did talk about the 8 characteristics of high functioning boards. Certainly not in maybe the depth I had expected. So I think there's still room for improvement on what are the research evidence based on how we can do our job really well, and what things help us and what maybe aren't so important.
Well, what I'd ask the board to do, and I'll do some brainstorming too, is how we acquire that information, or how we bring that to the board, because our work sessions, we have said we don't want presentations. This is our work session to work as a board. So maybe we call a special session or something before a board meeting. We'll have to look at that and see how we can address that. Okay?
and can I add one more thing?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily PD, but we had talked in our retreat about doing a book group, and I know Margot has an idea for a kickoff book. So I think that's something where, if we read things obviously that are relevant to education in some way, it's not technically professional development, but it expands our knowledge, and we have really rich discussions, and you know, I think that type of thing. And I'd love to have administration involved with that if they have time and bandwidth. I know they have a gazillion things on their plates, but you know, I think those opportunities are just really helpful for us.
Okay, thank you. Ms.
Yeah, and just to add, if there was something that and we could get better, 5 minutes or less, and in a superintendent report. A lot of times, requesting of staff to talk about what we love goes on and on and on, way too much. But we could get better at elevator speech about this, 2 to 3 minutes, leaving a couple minutes for questions. And I can work with myself and our team on what's the elevator speech for this, so that when you do have those conversations, you have a mind's eye of what they mean by that, what we mean by this. And it doesn't have to go into depth. And if you want depth, you talk with that person more. But if not, it could be, an elevator speech on that, and just get better at that. Just like videos, 2 to 3 minutes. We don't need long ones. So we can get better at that as administration, and that might be a venue to get those mini, just what do we mean by this, and
Right.
what's going on here?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we'll look at that and see how we can fit it in. Just last thing, new business. Is there any new business for the work session? Mr. Donnelly?
Thank you, Madam President. One thing that's coming up tonight under non-action items is the approval of an organizational chart. And I find organizational charts are really useful, but they have to have enough information on them about the positions. And from an organization point of view, I think I would like to see, and I've requested those in the past, and I know it was a big project and it never got completed, organizational charts that had more information about the actual positions, the ranges, and just more information than this particular basic chart presents. So if nobody else feels that that's important, I get that, and I guess, it's a resource question. But if any of the other board members would think that would be valuable, I'd like to see it on the organizational chart.
Ms. Mitchell?
Is that something you have, job descriptions for the different functions at this high level?
Through STAR, we could pull them from HR, but they've changed over time. So we would, even gathering it, because once you, what I did was just the basic level of my team, and this came about, Alicia found it in policy, and it wasn't in our original policy, but then when AASB, when we adopted AASB policy, it was in there. So it was not a practice of the district prior to this year. So I looked at the best practices for boards and superintendents, and basically that was what they had said. But we could certainly, I think you wanted salary ranges, job descriptions, and then funding sources, I think was a question. We can do that. It'll be a little bit more work, but if that's the desirable
Well,
information.
if we have 2 more board members that would like to see that, what we would have to do is put it in the RFI log, and then board members would have to vote on it as far as whether that's a priority or not. Yes, Ms.
I'm not sure the salary and funding source is necessary, because that's going to be in the budget book, right? We'll see all of those as we go through, and if you don't like it, we'll adjust if somebody had a question on what's that position do? Some of them are director IT, I can kind of figure those out pretty clearly. But I think if a board member has a question on, well, can you tell me a little bit about what this job does? I think that's reasonable. And I would expect you don't need a full job description. I have no doubt Dr. Bishop knows what these guys do. So you could just ask it even right now if there was one you weren't sure about. Or you can send the email within 9 days.
Why don't we, this is on our agenda tonight, and I think that would be, we can discuss it at that time. If anyone has any questions, then they can be asked at that time, if that's okay with the board. Okay, so any other new business? All right, at this time, I'm going to adjourn our work session, and we're gonna move into executive,
Yeah, there's a separate one in there. It's
Okay.
the uncontested student hearing.
uncontested student hearings and litigation is what we're going into, and negotiations. Okay,
And we have East High Pro Start here.
and East High Pro Start is here with our food.
I second that.
Okay, thank you.